Well, to talk about all of this, let's greet our panel. Joining us from London, Cristina Escobar is a Cuban journalist and commentator. Here with us in the studio, Jefferson Morley is a former reporter at the Washington Post and author of 3 books on the CIA. Lester Munson is a principal at BGR Group, a leading government relations firm here in Washington. And from Philadelphia, Alan McPherson is a professor of history at Temple University and author of the book, A Short History of U.S. Interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome to all of you. Jeff, let me start with you. The United States taking a very hard line in Venezuela, but Venezuela is not an isolated case. We've been hearing threatening noises being made against Nicaragua. There's pressure on Cuba, or at least more pressure on Cuba. None of these countries really pose a threat to the United States. So how do you explain this sort of renewed aggression against them?
Well, I think that you have policymakers who came in with a very aggressive stance, John Bolton, for example, and their initial place where they wanted to intervene, demonstrate American might, demonstrate their particular policy, was Syria, and President Trump kind of pulled the rug out from under them. The Venezuela crisis arose, and I think they jumped on it in kind of an opportunistic way as the crisis of the day, that they could demonstrate their policy and not be with the full backing of President Trump. I think for President Trump, doesn't really care about Venezuela. This is a way to make socialism an issue in the 2020 election. So I think there's a confluence of political and policy factors that lead them to Venezuela as opposed to Syria or Iran, which I think was their first choice.
Mr. What do you make of what is going on, especially these actions that have been taken against Venezuela, John Bolton threatening Nicaragua, more pressure on Cuba? I mean, we have heard that this might be about oil in Venezuela.
Well, let's not underestimate how much of this is actually driven by events in Venezuela, where the Maduro regime basically stole an election a few months ago. The situation there economically and from a humanitarian sense is deteriorating rapidly. That's a real thing that's happening because of the Maduro government itself. So the U.S. is in part responding, and actually in large part, I would say, responding to events in Venezuela. And let's face it, there's bipartisan support for President Trump's policy. There was a hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week. I think it was their first hearing of this Congress. And you saw both Marco Rubio and Bob Menendez, Republican, Democrat, basically agreeing with the Trump policy.
But Lester, if the issue is subversion of democracy in Venezuela, if that is the issue, why just Venezuela? There are other countries in the world where the United States should be taking action. There's Egypt, there's Saudi Arabia.
Well, 2 things. One, the U.S. has never applied that policy universally around the world. I suppose it would be a terrific thing if the U.S. could do that. It's not realistic. So it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. The U.S. has been a little tougher in that front in the Western Hemisphere, in countries in its backyard where the U.S. has tried to push out foreign influences. So this flirting with Russia that Venezuela's been doing lately. Just today, the Trump administration sanctioned a Russian bank that was taking steps to prop up the Maduro regime. So there's reasons the U.S. is a little tougher in its backyard.
Okay, let me bring in Cristina Escobar. She's in London. Cristina, great to see you again. The United States is taking a very tough position on Cuba as well. In fact, it's blaming Cuba for what is going on in Venezuela. This is what the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, had to say just a short while ago. Very hard words. Let's watch.
No nation has done more to sustain the death and daily misery of ordinary Venezuelans, including Venezuela's military and their families, than the communists in Havana. Cuba is the true imperialist power in Venezuela. I even hear that Maduro has no Venezuelans around him. Many of his personal security and closest advisors are acting not at the direction of the Venezuelan people, and frankly, perhaps not even at the direction of Maduro, but rather at the direction of the Cuban regime.
So, as I said, Cristina, a very hard position taken against Cuba by the U.S. administration there. What do you make of those words?
Well, it's actually, if the outcome of those words wouldn't be so tragic, it's actually quite hilarious to listen to that. Taking into consideration that this is an administration and a group of people, because we have to take into consideration who are the people who are pushing this kind of discourse and rhetoric. We're talking about Marco Rubio, we're talking about Elion Abrams, and John Bolton. John Bolton was a man that when the Iraq war, the excuse, the lie around the weapons of mass destruction, said that Cuba also had weapons of mass destruction and the United States should intervene also in Cuba. So this guy is back again and talking to the ears of the President of the United States. So it's hard to believe that any of these reasons are real. And we need to go to the facts, not to the opinions. There's no fact that actually supports what the State Department Secretary is saying. There's absolutely no fact. There are Cubans in Venezuela. You can go there and see them if you want. They're doctors, teachers, professors. But there's not such a thing as 25,000 soldiers. This is something also John Bolton said, Cubans in Venezuela. The lies and the constant propaganda to push a war on Venezuela is a reality. You just can see it just right now with a New York Times expose around the fact that the so-called burning of aid in the bridge between Venezuela and Colombia was not actually made by Maduro's loyalists, but by people who are against Maduro's government. So I really I have a hard time to believe and trust any of the things that are being said around this. It's not whether I like Maduro or I think is the way to go for the country, but that's up to Venezuelans, and this is the main issue here. It's not the place of Marco Rubio, who's made a political platform on hating and trying to destroy other governments. That's what his main job is around that, and talking about Cuba a lot, although he's never been to Cuba. He was not born in Cuba. But definitely Cuba is part of this rhetoric, although the reality is that there's no real information to back any of these statements.
Right. Alan McPherson, the United States does have a history of involvement, of interfering or meddling in countries in Latin America, a very long history. Are we seeing a return to those days now?
Well, we're not seeing return to those days yet. I mean, we're seeing some of the rhetoric in terms of, this being an option on the table. But this is a much sort of slower, much more multilateral economic movement of sanctions against Venezuela. We're also seeing this happening in a very different country. Venezuela is in South America. It's further away. And most importantly, it's much bigger than any country in Latin America that the United States has ever intervened in.
Jeff, if the United States is going about this because it feels that democracy has been subverted in Venezuela, and if we look at how they're doing it, they've appointed Elliot Abrams, special representative to Venezuela. He is a very controversial figure. Let's listen to something he said at a briefing at the State Department. Let's watch this.
The sanctions are much newer than the problems. This is a multi-year decline in Venezuela. The situation there, due to the mismanagement, the economic policies, and the sheer corruption of this regime, are the cause of those problems. So the United States did not cause those problems. The international community did not. The regime caused those problems.
What do you make of the appointment of Elliot Abrams? I mean, here's a man who was convicted for lying to Congress. He was involved in the Iran-Contra affair as well, a very controversial figure.
33 years ago, I wrote my first story about the CIA in Latin America, and it concerned the Reagan administration's program for regime change in Nicaragua. The point man on that policy was Elliot Abrams, and one of the chief things that they emphasized was humanitarian aid. That was a ruse at the time. You're correct. Abrams did lie about that under oath. He was convicted for that and then pardoned. So we've seen this movie before. The exact same characters, really a very similar situation, but as the other guest said, a much, much bigger country. So a much bigger roll of the dice for the United States, a much bigger commitment to making something happen. And what we're seeing so far is that the policy of confrontation isn't working. There have not been big defections from the military. Right. The incident on the border was contrived. The burning of the humanitarian aid trucks was not the responsibility of the Maduro government. It was from a Molotov cocktail thrown by the anti-government people. So we're seeing the same phenomenon that we see in regime change policies, which is confrontation and misleading propaganda in order to justify and drive a greater level of confrontation.
Lester, doesn't this sound like amateur hour?
Actually, no, I'll disagree.
Yeah.
I actually think this is, if you take a look at the policies of this administration, Venezuela stands out as having a sensible goal, as having actually a clear path towards getting to that goal and real, genuine support in Washington. It's true that Elliot Abrams may have made some mistakes in the past, and he kind of triggers a very negative reaction from progressives in this country. But he's also spent a lot of time working very hard on human rights and democracy issues. He's a genuine expert on Latin American affairs. I actually find him to be a very capable and thoughtful diplomat and actor here in Washington. And I think this is if you take a look at some of the Trump policies, particularly some of the ones in perhaps the Middle East or with Russia, this one is actually very clear, has a sensible outcome, he's got a broad base of support, and I think the approach has actually been very sensible.
Alan, what do you make of the choice of Elliot Abrahams to be the special representative?
Well, I mean, I agree with the last guest, which is that you know, Abrams is a professional diplomat. He's been doing this for a long time. He knows the region well. And he's especially well-trained in the rhetoric of democracy and human rights. He's been applying it since the 80s. And so for a Republican, he's quite moderate in this. But at the same time, the Trump administration, there's not that many Republicans even who want to work with the Trump administration, who want to be associated with it. And so they will work with anybody who's willing to do it for them. And so he's about as good as representative as they can get for working through this problem.
Lester, the United States National Security Advisor, John Bolton, he was asked on a U.S. television program if U.S. support for dictators in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates weakens the U.S. argument for interference in Venezuela. And this is what John Bolton said.
Look, in this administration, we're not afraid to use the phrase Monroe Doctrine. This is a country in our hemisphere. It's been the objective of American presidents going back to Ronald Reagan to have a completely democratic hemisphere.
So I guess in this day and age, I mean, the question that's being asked is what gives the United States the right to interfere in these countries? What gives the United States to appropriate to itself what's democracy, what's not democracy, etc.?
Well, before we just say it's the U.S. interfering, let's point out that there are real problems in Venezuela, the makings of this regime, the Maduro regime, which has hijacked democracy and done a terrible job of managing the economy. 1/10 of the population has fled to other countries, and the U.S. has actually diplomatically built up support for its policy with the Lima Group, which is the vast majority of countries in the Western Hemisphere, including Canada, a country that we don't agree with on a lot of these policies. Right. So the U.S. has actually done a lot of work to get to the point where there is most of the international community is arrayed against Maduro. The U.S. isn't intervening militarily, although people will say all options are on the table, but I think realistically we're not looking at any kind of U.S. military intervention. The U.S. is putting a lot of pressure on Venezuela to move towards democracy and to move towards a better humanitarian situation for its population. And I don't think the U.S. should apologize for it.
But it is being very selective in where it wants to implement.
That's true.
change.
And again, I think the U.S. will be selective on that policy. You can't do it everywhere. You should do it in the places where you can and where it's going to make a difference.
Cristina, what do you make of what Lester just told us, that there is considerable support, even in Latin America, the Lima Group, as Lester mentioned, that recognizes Juan Guaido as the leader, the president of Venezuela?
I think that anyone who feels a patriot, who loves the country in which they live, should feel, essentially in Latin America, should feel tremendously offended by the words which we just heard from John Bolton, that there's no fear of mentioning the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is the most imperialistic perspective, which we thought it was part of history, but as we can see is in the rhetoric of the current people in the U.S. administration. And I do have a suspicion, I do have the suspicion of listening all of this around the selective of working for the human rights and democracy in Venezuela. And this is something that hasn't been popped up in this show yet. And it's around the fact that I really wonder why the United States is not more focused on Haiti, or is not more focused on El Salvador, or on Honduras, which, by the way, their people are going over its borders, or is more worried about Mexico, other countries which are actually representing a big threat in terms of what's going on in the border, and is focuses on Venezuela. The reason is Venezuela has oil, and none of these other countries do. So it's a major interest, not only for the United States, but all over the world. And having a government that makes its own decisions and have this resource, which is so desirable for by so many people and so many countries and powers and elites, is obviously a big controversy. And another point on this, I've been listening again and again around the human rights and democracy. I come from a country in which, with those excuses, human rights and democracy, in an absolute interventionist perspective, all sorts of things have been made to my country, from the Bay of Pigs invasions in 1961 to Peter Pan operation, in which hundreds of families were separated from the children under the suspicion that Russians were going to take children away from their families. This happened in the 60s in Cuba, up to the embargo, which is the most complex system of sanctions that the United States has never placed in a country, and it's been on Cuba for almost 60 years. The excuse is to respect and promote democracy and human rights for the Cuban people, when the actual victims of these policies are the Cuban people. So I do believe is hypocrisy. It is not true, and what they are actually trying to push is an agenda in which they're going to benefit from controlling such a big resource and such an essential resource as oil, and Venezuela has the disgrace of having oil.
Alan, put this into some kind of historical context for us. There was a article that I saw written by the historian John Coatsworth, who pointed out that the U.S. has participated directly or indirectly in Latin American regime change more than 40 times in the last century. A lot of that happened, of course, during the Cold War. But how much has changed now?
A lot has changed. I mean, for John Bolton to say that it's not anachronistic to talk about a Monroe Doctrine or to believe that there's a Monroe Doctrine is absurd, because the norms have completely changed in the Western Hemisphere. All the documents say so. All Latin American diplomats say so. Nobody would really tolerate an American military intervention, especially a unilateral one. Now, what's actually happening is different from what John Bolton is saying. What's happening actually is multilateral diplomacy and economic sanctions, and so we've got so far a sort of coercive but still peaceful effort to try to unseat Maduro. And so that is different from the Cold War. We're also not talking about, Soviet interference or sort of a global threat to Latin America. And so the overall ideological rhetoric is largely dissipated, except for, I think, this kind of politically motivated association of Maduro's failure with socialism.
Jeff, Alan raises a good point there. We're not, of course, in a Cold War right now. There is no more Soviet Union. There is no fight between the major powers for influence around the world, but the world has changed. China has close relations with Venezuela. It continues to support the government of Nicolas Maduro. How important is that?
I think it's pretty important. I mean, there is the Lima Group. There is broad support for recognizing a new government, but there's by no means not a consensus, not an international consensus around this intervention. And that's going to give Venezuela cards to play. This rhetoric also on the part of the U.S. government, openly citing the Monroe Doctrine, talking about military intervention, this is going to help the regime with its internal cohesion. Nobody in Venezuela wants a U.S. military intervention. Even the opposition doesn't want that. There was a latest poll in January, I think 85% of the people were against the idea. So the more the U.S. talks about that, the more they ostentatiously say military intervention is on the table. We're still thinking about it. We're talking in terms of a Monroe Doctrine. That's going to help the government retain power. And this policy of confrontation is not succeeding. There's not defections from the military. The confrontation on the border, they may be helping Maduro survive in power by heightening the confrontation and making it a point of U.S. power.
Now, Lester, we have seen that. We've seen the pressure being ramped up over the last few weeks, but Maduro still remains firmly in control. And was it a mistake on the part of John Bolton to invoke the Monroe Doctrine?
Well, I don't know. The policy hasn't succeeded yet. It's an ongoing process. I think more and more pressure is going to be put on the Maduro regime. There were new sanctions just today, as we talked about earlier. So this this process is not over. And I do agree with Jeff to the extent that the more the U.S. can work with other countries in the region to make this look like a real, genuine, concerted effort, because that's what it is, the more effective it's going to be. If it looks like it's just the U.S. acting alone, it will help Maduro. So the U.S. needs to work in concert with other Latin American countries, those in the Lima group, to actually have a more effective policy.
But Lester, haven't we seen this movie before? I mean, 60 years of pressure on Cuba didn't change Cuba. In fact, President Obama recognized that and decided that he was going to restore diplomatic relations with Cuba.
Yes, and restoring diplomatic relations with Cuba didn't really work either. I think it's true. You know, there are limits to the effectiveness of economic sanctions. Right. There's no doubt about that. If sanctions were super effective, we would have democracy and freedom in Cuba right now, but we don't. We still have a very oppressive, abusive regime in Havana. So U.S. should remain modest and humble in what it can do with its policies, but I think it should continue to pursue the appropriate policy in Venezuela, which is what it's doing now.
Okay, Cristina, what do you make of that? I mean, do you see these tensions continue to rise in Venezuela? Is there going to be a way out of it to diffuse those tensions?
I think the situation is quite complicated, essentially, because there's a quite coordinated course against Maduro and to support this self-declared president, which is not such a thing and doesn't even have a government. But taking into consideration what the other guests have said, I think it's quite interesting to see that Maduro was elected by the Venezuelan people. The authorities that said so are the same authorities that confirmed that Juan Guaido was elected too. So you do recognize the elections in one case and not in the other. So in this case, this is also quite selective. Cuba is a quite different country and has a quite different history in comparison with Venezuela. The main issue here is around the fact that we have to wonder is it going to be any good for Venezuela or any of these Latin American countries, any of these intervention from the United States? The history tells you otherwise. There's no one example of anything good for the vast majorities of people in Latin America after interventions of the United States. I'm talking about military dictatorships as Pinochet in Chile, many other examples that we don't have time to get into. So this is the real question, whether the United States pushing an agenda is going to succeed or not. Is this good for the Venezuelan people? I have a hard time to believe that.
Okay, Alan, very quickly, I've got a minute left. I mean, ultimately, is this about, as Jeff pointed out at the beginning of the show, about the Venezuelan military? Nicolas Maduro still enjoys the support of that military, and as long as he does, can he be moved out?
I think it is largely about the military. I mean, the United States can impose a lot of sanctions, but it didn't work against Cuba. And the Chinese and the Russians are not trying to, to help the United States in this way. They can buy Venezuelan petroleum. So it's really about peeling off as many supporters as possible from the Venezuelan military and turning him on the side of Guaido against Maduro.
Do you see that happening, Jeff?
I don't know. I do not. I do not. This policy is not working, and it's not going to work. And if you look at the other democratic transitions that Elliott Abrams presided over in El Salvador and Guatemala, to name two, the results are failed states. And I'm afraid that's what Venezuela is headed into, is the situation of being a failed state as a result of U.S. policy.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.